I'm going to take you on a journey. It is going to be a very intense journey, so brace yourself. If you are a believer or a non-believer, I'm going to challenge you and I'll make no apologies. This is the Origin of Nations Part 2. And in this study, we will attempt to answer many pressing questions of our time. As you analyze and go through the content of this study, as I always encourage you, please research everything you see in this study. This study will be divided into 3 sections. In part 1, we will be looking at the trivialization of the fall of man, but asking some very potent questions. Why are the earliest skulls of man a lot bigger to the skulls of man today? And why do modern crocodiles pale in comparison to early crocodiles, whose skulls alone were almost 6 feet in length? Why do people still revere the ideas of Sigmund Freud and Charles Darwin? And why do people believe that aliens once came down to Earth and taught early man civilization? And why have many modern Christians also embraced the idea that angels who are not flesh and blood mix their DNA with human DNA? In part 2, we will look at why the serpent was once the most revered deity on the entire planet, why the CIA has an interest in Mount Ararat in Turkey, and why the Chinese have preserved one of the oldest records of man in their pictograms. And in part 3, we're going to look at death. We'll look at what many people believe happens after we die and compare it with what the Holy Scriptures actually says. So here is a quick summary of this study. Let us now start our journey. Our journey begins in Great Britain, an island in the North Atlantic Ocean at the tip of continental Europe. And in its capital city, London, the world's leading financial centre for international business and commerce, is a church in the Barbican, one of the few surviving medieval churches in the city of London, called St. Giles Without Cripplegate. And inside of that church are the buried remains of a 17th century Englishman called John Milton. This English poet, polemicist and statesman left a deep mark on the world, and there is no other figure in Britain who has more monuments erected than him in their honour. At the Royal Academy of Arts in Piccadilly, London, there is a bust of him on the front building. In Hammersmith Library in West London on Shepherd's Bush Road, there is a statue of John Milton on the top left at the main entrance. The International Institute for Strategic Studies in West Central London in Holborn, Camden, on the front of the building is also a bust of John Milton. Overlooking the River Thames on Victoria's Embankment is an institution supported by US Bank JP Morgan, the City of London School. And at the top of the building there is also a bust of John Milton. Even in London's Westminster Abbey, there is a bust erected in his honour. Why is John Milton so unique to this time? What did he say that is so pressing? And how does a man 4 centuries ago still impact the digital age? What did he say?
To those who demand that Al Jazeera be shut down
and that people's right to the truth be suppressed,
we too have demands.
We demand journalists be able to do their jobs
free from intimidation and threat.
نطالب أن يحفظ للناس حقهم في الوصول إلى المعلومة
دون انحياز ولا تدليس.
نطالب بإسماع صوت المهمشين والمنسيين في أصقاع العالم.
We demand diversity of thought and opinion be cherished,
not feared.
We demand journalists aren't treated as criminals.
We demand
press freedom.
The most pressing issue of our time is free speech, especially how it relates to a free press. All over the world, people are being impacted by the censoring of the media by governments who fear that their authority will be challenged, and some have paid the price with their lives. In Mexico, journalists are regularly murdered. In Malta, a female journalist's car was bombed and she was killed. An outspoken Saudi journalist working for the Washington Post was murdered after entering into the Saudi embassy in Turkey. In Vietnam, bloggers who speak out against the government can get up to 10 to 15 years in jail. That's crazy. And Turkey is known as the jail capital of the world for outspoken journalists who are incarcerated for even mentioning the Armenian massacre. But Britain is a place where they are clamping down on a free press quite harshly, and very few can see what is happening. And when WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange published classified government documents and released them to the public, the British government has passed laws that will jail any spy, civil servant or journalist for 14 years who leaks any government secrets to the public. On the Global World Index, Britain ranks number 40 in the world for a free press, when it was the very first country who also introduced to the rest of the entire world a free press. And many who are carefully observing are aware that if this global trend continues unchecked, it can lead to very horrible, catastrophic results.
Have you ever seen a physical book before?
By the time you guys grow up, there won't be one book left.
Yes, sir! Little knowledge is a dangerous thing. News, facts, memoirs, internet of old. Burn it.
Even at the Doors received a message from YouTube that the European Parliament under Article 13 in 2018 is pushing for a copyright directive that is generating intense debate in both the tech and the media industries. Is science fiction turning into a fact? This law, if enforced, could threaten social media if an individual user uploads either an image, a newspaper article, a clip of a film or documentary, or plays someone's music and puts it onto a blog or into their social media account without paying some kind of tax or royalties. Many see this as a complete threat to the entire internet and a violation of free speech. And whenever this sensitive topic is being discussed, there is one name that always pops up: John Milton. For he was one of the leading advocates in modern times who zealously championed the cause of free speech and human rights, who many cite when they want to defend their cause. He coined the phrase self-esteem and the word pandemonium, and scholars in the United States praise him for laying the very foundation of the US Bill of Rights, especially in the First Amendment, that can be traced to his 1644 defense of free speech, Aria Praetorica. Cromwell, who had a will of iron and an intolerant Calvinistic attitude towards dissent, believed that England should have an established church. Milton disagreed and believed that there should be no state church, nor a state-paid clergy, nor any denomination, and believed in a total separation between church and state. If he was alive today, he would have definitely clashed with the evangelicals in the United States, for he did not believe that religion should play a role in a government policy. He saw it as a very, very dangerous mix. If churches want to reform society, they need to clean up their own houses first before they tell anyone about morality. And in 1659, Milton wrote that it is unlawful for the civil magistrates to use force in matters of religion. One writer in Britain knew the benefits of Milton's legacy and understood the importance of individual liberties, and the Scottish intellectual, historian and writer Dr. James Aitken Wiley wrote something that everyone in the world can relate to. Of all earthly possessions, liberty is the most precious. It is brought at a greater price and preserved with greater watchfulness than any other. He knew what was the root cause of Milton's legacy, but if it was not for the Reformation, Wiley said, Milton would had never sung. So how far did Milton's legacy reach? Galileo is the name given to the global navigation satellite that was created by the European Union through the European Global Navigation Satellite Systems Agency. It was named after the 17th century Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei, whose introduction of the modern telescope gave the modern world a more broad understanding of the heavens. Around the years 1638 to 1639, the 30-year-old English Protestant John Milton paid a visit to the 77-year-old Italian Catholic Galileo in Florence, Italy, who was blind and under house arrest from 1633 till his death under the Roman Inquisition. John Milton was also wrestling with ecclesiastical tyranny in his native England, offered support to this ailing scientist, and mentioned him in a number of his works. But Galileo was not the last Italian Milton was going to give aid to. John Milton was a linguist who was fluent in Latin, French, Spanish, Dutch, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and his native English, which is why he was appointed to Cromwell's government, and in 1655 in the Italian section of the Alpine Mountains, the now forgotten once infamous Easter massacre took place, and Samuel Morland was sent to the valleys in Italy to inspect and record one of the worst violations of human rights committed on an innocent community of Christians called the Waldenses. Neither age nor gender was spared by this genocide of the Roman Catholic Church, who wanted to cleanse Europe of any brand of nonconformist Christianity that didn't submit itself to the earthly authority of the pontiff. The British government raised just over £37,000 in aid to support the survivors of that massacre, and Milton wrote letters to the Protestant states of Europe and even to a member of the French government, Cardinal Mazarin, a close ally of the Italian government that carried out the massacre. But in Bunhill Fields in London, England, an open burial ground, is the grave of an English historian who documented what work made Milton famous, a work that will be the foundation throughout the rest of this study. Daniel Neal published in 1732 his History of the Puritans, and this is what he said when describing the English poet. The great man, Milton, born in London and educated in Christ's College, Cambridge, where he discovered an uncommon genius, which was very much improved by his travels. He was a man of unequaled genius, and acquired immortal fame by his incomparable poem of and highlighted and read, Paradise Lost, in which he manifested such a sublimity of thought and such elegance of diction as perhaps were never exceeded in any age or nation of the world. 18th century English writer Samuel Johnson, whose statue is in a Strand in London, said Paradise Lost is the highest production of the human mind. The BBC said it is the greatest epic poem in the English language. The Smithsonian said it has been translated more than 300 times in at least 57 languages. In 1665, when the Great Plague spread throughout London, Milton and his family went into a temporary quarter in a small village called Chalfont St. Giles in Buckinghamshire, about 23 miles from London, to escape the plague. He was fully blind by then after years of constant study, but this was his refuge till the plague was eradicated from London. The place he stayed in was peaceful and serene. If the garden was around in Milton's day, there he had a place where he could detach from the city life of London. But in this room, in this house, John Milton would share what was in his head to his wife, the 10,000-line poem called Paradise Lost. How he accomplished such a feat without his sight is a phenomenon. He could not publish it straight away, for in the year 1666 was the Great Fire of London. Some saw it as a papist plot, others saw it as a blessing, for it got rid of the plague. But in the following year, 1667, with a publishing price of 3 shillings, the first edition of Paradise Lost was published. To summarize this poem, its overall message is the fall of Lucifer, the creation of this world, and the creation and the fall of man, and a coming Saviour. It is written in the style of the Greek poet Homer, which is blank verse, which means it does not have any rhyme and irregular rhythms in its diction. Though you do not take every single line of Milton's as the gospel, but measure it according to the Bible, he did use a bit of Greek history that was a similar style like the Apostle Paul, to convey an object lesson and to build a bridge to reach a specific mindset. In Titus 1 and verse 12, Paul quotes from the 600 BC Cretan Greek philosopher poet Epimenides. In Acts chapter 17 and verse 28, he quotes from the Greek didactic poet Aratus of Cilicia. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 24 and 25, he used the Olympics to explain salvation to the Greek mind but not to glorify Zeus, and showed that the reward or crown at the Olympics is corruptible, but the eternal crown in heaven is incorruptible. Today's generation is being taught many different ideas of man's origins and how he developed technologically. The dominant view that is taught is that he evolved from some primeval primate beast, though the fossil record is scant, and that the earliest man was a primeval savage who lacked speech or no technological advancement. When modern man cannot explain the technologically advanced architecture from Mexico, they are now teaching this generation via the power of film that aliens came down and assisted them, and the modern mind that very rarely researches what is given to them embraces it hook, line, and sinker. But even in Christian circles, they have a similar belief that fallen angels came down to earth, which is scriptural, but that they had a sexual liaison with human beings, mixing with their DNA, that produced the early giants in the earth. And this is meant to be in an apocryphal book titled the Book of Enoch. And many Christians are embracing this unscriptural angel-human sexual liaison. But it is important that we stop and think and analyze everything that is given to us and ask some timely, pressing questions and seek answers which Paradise Lost does. Why is the serpent so revered? Why does both man and living creatures experience death? Why do women suffer in childbirth? Why are there so many different climates all over the planet? And why is there so much water that covers the canopy of the globe? Today's generation is being sucked into a climate of fear, where via entertainment and news, minds are being gently molded into a nihilistic euphoria. Many people are observing that everything is not right, for they are seeing whole communities reduced to rubble. And to escape, they are now running to the rubble in the past for answers. Whenever the world reaches a deep crisis or turning point, people always reminisce on the good old days, where you could leave your doors open and children could play outside freely. But when they start to see war or pandemonium plague a society, they always look to the future for something better than this world in order to escape the reality around them. The human heart, Wiley says, is the same whether it beats under a garment of oxhide or under a vesture of fine linen. It ever goes back into the past or forward into the future in quest of the elements of hope and happiness. Today, scholars are carefully scrutinizing every single belief system and idea to see if they have either failed or benefited a society. When the narrator was studying media, one was exposed to the teachings of 5 individuals. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was an 18th century Geneva philosopher who abandoned his 5 children, taught the natural goodness of man and the general will that everyone should conform to the society, and he shaped the Enlightenment and the philosophy of the French Revolution. Friedrich Hegel was a German philosopher whose philosophy of German idealism of no absolutes, like Rousseau's general will, is now being rejected. for they are both destructive. If there was one country on the continent of Europe where atheism could vent out its poison of frustration, it was in England. In Golders Green Crematorium in northwest London are the cremated remains of an Austrian Jew, Sigmund Freud, who taught an erotic philosophy and that all of our reality is in our subconscious. He taught that when a baby male child is being breastfed, it is having sexual thoughts of its mother. The narrator never attended lectures on his philosophy. Karl Marx, a German Jew and a student of the teachings of Hegel, like Freud, also found a solace in Britain. As scholars carefully analyze the teachings of Karl Marx on the left, Sigmund Freud in the center, and German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the father of existentialism and the fifth person, the London Economist is clear that of the three great secular faiths born in the 19th century, Darwinism, Marxism and Freudism, the second died swiftly and painfully, and the third is slipping away peacefully. Sigmund Freud's ideas was influenced by the use of cocaine. Nietzsche, like Marx, believed that blacks should be kept as slaves, and Marx's ideas have also cost the lives of millions of people. On the famous Harley Street in London once lived a man who has influenced modern-day geology, Scotsman Sir Charles Lyell, who authored the principles of geology that introduced uniformitarianism. In Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey, there is a family grave with a memorial to him. He was to strongly influence another naturalist. In Highgate Cemetery, just opposite Karl Marx's grave, is the grave of Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase the survival of the fittest. He was also to influence another naturalist. In East Finchley Cemetery, there is a grave of a man called Thomas Henry Huxley. He has greatly influenced the structure of modern education, and he was to be an influential mouthpiece for a naturalist. Inside of London's Natural History Museum, there is a marble statue of him to honour him, but at the other end of the museum is a statue of another naturalist who was influenced by Sir Charles Lyell and Herbert Spencer, and who Thomas Huxley was to be his most vocal mouthpiece, Charles Darwin. His ideas of an aquatic origin can be traced back to Anaximander, the Greek philosopher. He once lived on Gower Street in London, the current headquarters of UCL, and he was adamant that he totally rejected God, even though there are Christians who still try to claim him. His most famous work is The Origin of Species, and what people are unaware of, he actually questions his own ideas. Man is descended from some lower form, notwithstanding that connecting links have not hitherto been discovered. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Huxley also said, where then must we look for primeval man? Was the oldest Homo sapiens Pliocene and Miocene, or yet more ancient? In still older strata, do the fossilized bones of the ape more anthropoid or a man more pithecoid than any yet known await the researches of some unborn paleontologists? Time will show. So what has time shown? These men's ideas are still being shared to the public through the power of entertainment, though there is no evidence to support it. But as scientists carefully study primates and human beings, they are observing the clear differences. The narrator filmed this chimpanzee in Whipsnade Zoo. They are hairy from head to foot, and their bottom feet are designed for climbing trees. You can see how they resemble hands. In the Natural History Museum, you can clearly see on the left that a primate's hands are totally different to humans' hands. Many of them resemble claws, and scientists are still writing documents attempting to convince people that man was once hairy like primates, though providing no evidence. But when scientists do conduct proper forensics on human hands and primate hands, and observe the bone structure in each of our wrists and knuckles, they are coming to some very interesting conclusions. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America documents that independent evolution of knuckle walking in African apes shows that humans did not evolve from a knuckle walking ancestor. Today, people still have confidence in science, but some are challenging mainstream scientific thinking, for they are observing that they don't always share correct data. There are errors in carbon dating. They still have not found the missing link between monkey and man, and people are believing less in evolution and have more of a distrust in mainstream science. So what is man now seeking for?
In today's dynamic world, one constant holds true: facts matter more than ever.
Many people's eyes are now opening to the reality that the wisdom of this world is indeed foolishness with God. There is only one safe place we can guide man so that he does not lose his way. And if you follow the compass in the right direction, you'll be led to the Holy Scriptures. What man speculates on in his finite thinking, the Word of God gives clarity on. But where do we start? What book do we begin our journey on? There are people who want to stress that we are at the end, and these are the signs of the times. But you cannot stress on the end without first taking people to the beginning, for that is the only way you will have a clear understanding of what is taking place today. So we're going to start from the very beginning in the book of Genesis. But once you have a starting point, the missing pieces of the jigsaw will fit together perfectly. When astronauts look out of the window of their shuttle and see a vast terrain of blue, when they're in their spacesuit and see this amazing planet we call the Earth, they are seeing the skilled handiwork of an artist who mapped out every color, shape, and size in intricate minute detail. The Earth may not look like how it was originally, but it has still retained some of its beauty for the many years it has been constantly spinning in the universe. The aquatic world is still full of different creatures of different shapes and colors. Some are very small with beautiful blue eyes. Some are absolutely huge where they are being groomed by other fish. When a camera slows down its speed, we can see the beauty of a bird when it is airborne in flight, thrusting its wings with the currents of the air. An insect can also propel itself into the air, and its mechanics, that is every proportion of its body, its antennae, wings, and thorax, were all perfectly designed by a creator. He made the flowers to bloom at a specific time, each with their own distinct smell. And even when there is a lot of rough landscape, you can still admire the beauty of creation. But God not only wanted his creation to recognize his mighty works, he also instructs us to carefully study what he has created, and not to speculate on this earth origins like secular scientists. If you would have a really true and useful science, you must go to nature, Wiley says. You must study her laws. You must observe her workings, every flower and crystal and piece of matter, animate and inanimate, organic and inorganic. You must put her to the question. You must sit down at her feet and become her disciple and listen reverentially to her voice. That is true science. One of the most interesting creatures in the animal kingdom is an insect called the ant. And out of all the species on this earth, God instructs each one of us to be true scientists and study that unique creature. Why? Today, people are studying how to reduce traffic in high concentrated cities. For when there is a jam, you are just gridlocked. So scientists are studying the ant colony to help reduce traffic in the cities. Google is the most popular search engine in the world for acquiring information. And every time we type, they track everything we log on to and create a digital database through a digital process called algorithms. But the ant colony is even smarter than Google, and they are learning from the ant on how to boost the computer network. Doctors prescribe antibiotics to patients to fight any fungal infection in their bodies, with their many side effects. But by studying the ant colony, they want to improve on the development of antibiotics. Even when they study the flow of water in their system and how it pumps, once again, scientists are learning from the ant. Man has always used solar energy, for he has seen its vital importance. For without the sun, this earth wouldn't last very long. But as scientists study the ant, they've also observed that the sun is central to the ant to guide it as a GPS tracking system. Man has built very sturdy bridges in order to get through a lot of treacherous terrain and to help us to get from one place to another. But the best bridge builders on this planet is the ant, where they interlocked their jaws and bodies to make a floating raft. That's amazing. The ant, after thousands of years, is still an ant, no evolving. But there is one big difference. The earliest ants were once the size of a hummingbird, and when they discovered a fossil of a queen ant in North America, it was more or less the same size of a hummingbird. This is a common trend throughout the whole of the animal kingdom. Penguins today are small flightless birds. When they found the earliest fossil remains in Antarctica, Australia and New Zealand, they were as tall as 2 meters, about the same height or a little taller than a man. And when they measured the beaks of these early and current birds, the earliest penguins were bigger than the ones we see today. Hollywood loves to entertain people and show colossal creatures like a giant alligator that man tampered with to make people gripped with awe at these huge creatures with CGI technology. When we look at alligators and crocodiles today, it does seem a bit far-fetched that they were ever that large. But guess what? They actually were. In the Sahara Desert in Nigeria and West Africa, they found a huge crocodile buried in the sand, tucked away for thousands of years. Its skull alone was nearly 6 feet in length, and its entire length was 40 feet. A modern crocodile would be minute in comparison to its early reptilian forebears. And once again, we have seen that species over the years have shrunk. When they carefully observed this crocodile from the Sahara Desert, it was discovered that it was almost the length and size of a bus. Can you imagine seeing a creature the size of a bus running towards you at top speed? You've had it. But were reptiles always killers? Hollywood is one of the most powerful indoctrinating tools on this planet, and would like us to believe that is the case. And how many people actually question what is given to them? For the imagery you see in films is also the imagery you see in the museums, and we are led to believe that these animals were always ferocious carnivores until scientists actually put their own theory to the test. When they have gone into the lab and have carefully observed the teeth of these early reptiles, they were not made for cutting into flesh. And on close examination of early dinosaur dung, the small particles also contained something that shocked scientists. Secular science once taught that plants evolved after dinosaurs, when the Bible taught that plants were created by God on the 3rd day of creation. But scientific examination published in their journals has showed that dinosaurs were originally vegetarians who once grazed on grass, a very big contrast to how they are presented to the public by the enticement of Hollywood. Which faith fits the facts? And the evidence is leaning closer to the biblical account in the book of Genesis. That is why scientists are finding it very difficult to fit them into a family tree. Because God said in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 30 that He created all living creatures as herbivores. John Milton in his Paradise Lost said, "Thus God the heaven created, thus the earth, matter unformed and void, darkness profound covered thy abyss, but the watery calm his brooding wings the Spirit of God outspread." He was paraphrasing Genesis chapter 1. Today, in the West, there is an emphasis on eating healthy. It was once seen as a left-wing New Age fad, but as more people are seeing their close friends and relatives die from cancer, they are taking heed to the counsel of eating organic food to combat diseases. An Italian woman told the narrator a number of years ago that while eating organic is a modern trend, it has always been a part of the Italian diet. And when scientists of recent have been researching communities around the world who live long, have less stress, and are void of cancers and heart disease, one of the places they've been led to is in Italy, for their lifestyle and their diet has given them a much longer lifespan. In North America, there was an individual who taught the importance of incorporating the original organic plant-based diet in our daily intake of food to sustain our health. And George Washington Carver was more than qualified to give that advice, for he was skilled in analyzing the natural world and spent an entire lifetime teaching and studying nature. And this is what he advised. More and more, as we come closer and closer in touch with nature and its teachings, are we able to see the divine and are therefore fitted to interpret correctly the various languages spoken by all forms of nature about us, just as Wiley said. My lifetime study of nature in its many phases leads me to believe more strongly than ever in the biblical account of man's creation as found in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27. If you go to the first chapter of Genesis, we can interpret very clearly, I think, what God intended when he said, "Behold, I have given you every herb that bears seed. To you it shall be for meat." This is what he means about it. It shall be for meat. There is everything there to strengthen and nourish and keep the body alive and healthy. You see, the best form of science is not through speculation, but through investigation. This is God's way, and this is the method both Wiley and Carver advise us to follow. Milton said in Paradise Lost, "This garden, planted with the trees of God, detectable both to behold and taste, and freely all their pleasant fruit for food." Even after the flood in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 3, God said that the green herb should still be a part of our daily diet alongside the animal flesh. And a US cardiologist, when researching another community that also lived long, found that there was a group that followed God's plan and were one of the most healthiest people on the planet. They are a community in China who, like the Italians, also live past 100 years old. But what is their secret? On a close inspection of this community of centenarians, they observed that they have no air pollution, and Papuan residents subsist on a diet consisting mostly of fresh fruit and vegetables, 3 times more veggies than fruits, roots, legumes, and nuts. They eat fish occasionally and meat only on special occasions. They don't have doctors, medication, or hospitals. Yet the villagers live these remarkable healthy lives. They also get enough sleep, a critical component of good health, according to the New York Post. They also plant their own food and share it with their own neighbors who are without. When you garden and plant your own food, it tastes a lot more richer and healthier than what you get from the store. It is also important that children are exposed to the garden from a very early age. The more they spend time in nature, the more it will develop their cognitive thinking. Parents should start children gardening from very early, for it will help them to develop life skills for future development and teach them how to manage even the smallest things from very early. While this may be far-fetched to some, these early stages of development in the garden is being verified by science. For studies are showing that gardening with kids cultivate life skills. It can help build healthier, happier kids. It helps a child's development. Gardening can boost literacy and numeracy. It helps children who have special needs, and it affects your child's brain, body, and soul. It has a lot of healing properties when you spend time in nature. It helps you to feel renewed inside. It can help people improve their mental health. It is therapeutic for patients who suffer dementia and patients who suffer Alzheimer's. And as scientists conduct studies, they are seeing the psychological benefits of gardening and spending time in nature. While scientists may think they have discovered this formula for human happiness, if they had only read the Bible, the very first thing that God instructed man to do is spend time where? In the garden. Everything takes you back to Genesis. Milton says, Adam, the godliest man since born, his sons the fairest of her daughters Eve, under a tuft of shade that on a green stood whispering soft by a fresh mountainside. They sat them down, and after no more toil of their sweet and highlighted in red, gardening them sufficed. Today, a lot more people are exercising to keep their bodies trim and more healthy. But they are still observing that modern life is stressing people out a lot more. There are longer working hours and less of a community and not enough of a family structure and a social network to support people. When doctors carefully analyze the bodies of modern humans, they are discovering something quite interesting that interferes how we view the past. They are observing that modern civilization is making humanity less intelligent. The human race has peaked in many areas and will now decline, say scientists. And this peak took place thousands of years ago. Our bones are a lot weaker than the early hunter-gatherers or earlier man to properly describe them. We have turned from athletes to couch potatoes, according to the University of Cambridge. Our Stone Age bodies struggle to stay healthy in modern times, and we are weaklings compared with our ancient ancestors. When scientists carefully observed our early ancestors on the continents of Afro-Eurasia, like the creatures in the animal kingdom, whether it was insects, birds, or reptiles, mankind has not evolved, but shrunk. When paleoanthropologists unearthed the skeletal remains of our early forebears, the modern skull on the left is a lot smaller to the Neanderthal skull on the right, which confirmed that early man was bigger in stature in comparison to modern man. This man is of European descent and would be classified under the racial category of Caucasian, a people who originally populated the Northern Hemisphere. This man is of Asian descent. He is from a people who originally populated the East, also categorized as the Orient. When men have carefully analyzed through DNA the inhabitants of Eurasia, they discovered that they still have traces of Neanderthal DNA in their genes, and that Neanderthal man was a human being just like us, not a separate species. So was early man in Eurasia a lot more bigger in stature and a lot more taller? According to the latest studies, in recent years we have discovered that so many of our perceptions about people who lived in the Stone Age, more properly known as the Mesolithic era, were wrong. They had a spoken language perhaps as rich as ours, for their mental capacity was the same. They were about as tall as us. They lived almost as long. A study of skeletons in Greece and Turkey found that the average height of humans dropped 6 inches between the end of the Ice Age and 3000 BC. Modern Greeks and Turks still haven't regained the height of their hunter-gatherer ancestors, according to the New Yorker. Commercials on TV give us a false perception of what early man was like. But when they discovered a stone bracelet in Siberia, a country geographically located in Eurasia and North Asia, the earliest men were far more technologically advanced than perceived. The Siberian Times said it was the oldest stone bracelet ever found. But the Daily Mail showed that our ancestors were far more sophisticated than thought, for the technology that was used to carve it were drills just like modern tools. Our early forebears were clearly highly advanced, But this is not how they are presented in the textbooks, films, advertisements, and in documentaries. For scientists have found that a hole in the Siberian bracelet had been drilled in part of the bracelet with such precision that it could only have been done with a high rotation drill similar to those used today. The narrator discovered that the Daily Mail newspaper was the only mainstream Western journal that recorded the discovery of this green Siberian stone bracelet, which shows that they would prefer that as few people as possible know about this artifact, for it would shatter and challenge people's perceptions of early man. The cold region of Siberia also had another interesting discovery. The current inhabitants of Siberia have been racially categorized as Mongoloid or Oriental, though people of Asia do not particularly like to be described in that way. From how they are dressed, you can see it is very, very cold. But DNA has shed some light on Siberia's earliest inhabitants. They have been labeled as Denisovans. But what is even more interesting is that these early Siberians had very, very big teeth. When they were first discovered, scientists thought they belonged to a bear. But on closer inspection, they saw that they were human teeth. And though it's difficult to extrapolate much from a tooth, according to the Washington Post, this new one's unusual size affirms one of the only things we do know about the Denisovans. They were large. So our teeth today, as well as our cranium, are a lot smaller than our early forebears. We will look at one more region. Abiy Ali is the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who is trying to build bridges with dissident groups who fled the country and the conflicts within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He is also trying to heal the ethnic clashes in Ethiopia that has damaged the country in recent years, for Ethiopia is a country that contains over 80 different ethnic groups. Some have light brown skin, like this Ethiopian Orthodox bishop. Some have very dark brown skin whose face is adorned in tribal paint. Some have long facial features with a longer nose and straighter hair. Some have a thicker nose, thicker lips, and more of a curlier hair texture. DNA tests in that region of Africa has shown some very interesting results. It is highlighting some of the earliest discoveries of black African genomes, and that many people from the Middle East interbred with some of the earliest inhabitants. Time magazine showed that the earliest Ethiopians were Homo sapiens, who looked like us, walked like us, and talked like us. And Australopithecus afarensis, better known as Lucy, walked upright like modern-day humans. As paleoanthropologists carefully observe the earliest skulls from Ethiopia, they found similar results like the Neanderthals of Europe and the Denisovans of Asia. It was discovered that studies of fossilized human remains found in Ethiopia date back, according to their timescale, 200,000 years, were larger and more robust than their modern-day counterparts, said Dr. Marta Lahr, an expert in human evolution. As they study the human brain and compare brains of modern man with their very early forebears, they are also coming to the same conclusions. The male brain of 20,000 years ago, according to their timescale, measured 1,500 cubic centimeters. Modern human brain averages just 1,350 cubic centimeters, a decrease equivalent to the size of a tennis ball. The female brain has shrunk by about the same proportion. Mankind is actually shrinking. Cambridge University experts say humans are past their peak and that modern-day people are 10% smaller and shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. So no matter what ethnicity you are categorized in, mankind has not evolved but shrunk. And this is the results of careful scientific investigation. Both man and creatures have gone down the same path. In a book titled The Origin of Nations, by the late 19th century Oxford history professor George Rawlinson. He records and said that we shall allege first and foremost that sacred record, which is, even humanly speaking, one of the most valuable fragments of antiquity that has come down to us. The opening section of Genesis chapters 1 to 5. In this, we found our first parents represented much as Milton has drawn them. Milton says, two of far nobler shape, and highlighted in red, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honour clad in naked majesty, seemed lords of all, and worthy seemed, for in their looks divine, the image of the glorious Maker shone. The earth we inhabit is made out of many different materials, and it was these materials that God moulded, shaped and designed man from. Man meaning both male and female. The minutest part of the body was carefully thought out and designed by God. Originally, man was naked and he was not ashamed. He had a spiritual covering that came with obedience. What must it have been like when man's first parents saw their reflection in the water to see what they looked like, and carefully observing the ripples in the water? Being first instructed to look after the garden, they must have explored nature, smelt the sweet-smelling aroma of fresh plants and trees and the dewdrops on a leaf. Naming every animal must have been an interesting task. You see, God was training Adam to be a zoologist, biologist, and a scientist when he was observing the intricate traits, mannerisms, colors, shapes, sounds, and design of every single creature, so that he could name each one of them. It must have been interesting to see an insect crawl 1 minute, then flying the next minute, and seeing fish that could fly out of the water, and others that could walk on land. Mammals that could fly like birds and insects, mammals that could swim like fish, and mammals that could lay eggs like reptiles and birds. Every creature was originally a herbivore. There was no death. The herb-bearing seed made up their daily diet. But God instituted a memorial in order that man never forgets who put everything in place on this earth. He gave to man something that would always remind him that God was indeed the creator. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2, the English word rested is a translation of the Hebrew word Shabbat that we call the Sabbath. In Paradise Lost, John Milton said in Book 7, creation and the 6 days' acts they sung. With hallelujahs, thus was Sabbath kept. But something was going to happen on this earth that was to change everything, and we are still feeling the effects today. Something that most don't understand. Nature was to turn on each other, and creatures that once lived in harmony were to become foe and prey. Fishes not only had to watch their back so they wouldn't become a meal, but they also had to be on guard on what was hunting them from above, so they always have to be on alert. Childhood is meant to be the most cherished thing in life, to prepare us for adulthood so we're not walking around with unresolved issues. But there are innocent children who are sadly caught in the middle of a crossfire over tribal conflicts, where they are exposed to war, cholera, and famine. And they experience from very early what others only see in later life. You may wonder what that is. When a baby is born, it is oblivious to its surroundings. It is new to the world. It grows into a young child. That child then grows into an adolescent, a teenager. That teenager then grows into an adult. For a while, the adult retains its youthful looks. But then the lines and wrinkles kick in, and they realize they are aging. But as they grow even older, they now have to confront a reality. A reality every single one of us has to face. When a person has lost someone close to them, what do you say when you see the tears are pouring down their face? Explaining death to anyone is a difficult task in itself. But where did death come from? John Milton paraphrases portions of Genesis chapter 3, Isaiah chapter 14, and Revelation chapter 12, and he said, "The infernal serpent, he it was whose guile stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind. What time his pride had cast him out from heaven, with all his host of rebel angels, by whose aid aspiring to set himself in glory above his peers, he trusted to have equaled the Most High." Today, the fall of Lucifer is being cleverly counteracted through the teaching of philosophy in the social sciences, via the enticing power of music, through comic books and TV shows, and the New Age Gnostic high criticism school of theology that has crept into the churches. Music is the most powerful of the mediums, and the album cover of musician Jim Steinman shows Lucifer with a musical instrument in his right hand, chains broken off in his left hand, with a tattoo on his left arm with the words "bad for good" as he looks up to heaven. There are comics called Lucifer, and Volume 1 has written on the front, "Will sin for food." And there is a sort of empathy for Satan, and also a mockery on the fall of Lucifer, where music, TV shows, and philosophers all praise the fallen one by telling you to knock, knock, and let the devil in.
Knock, knock, let the devil in, malevolent as I've ever been.
Lucifer Morningstar, is that a stage name?
God-given, I'm afraid.
What's your name?
Lucifer.
Like an apple.
Exactly.
I suppose, given a choice, I think I would pick hell. The reason I'd pick hell is because that's where all the have-nots are.
The late Saul Alinsky was a Jewish-American writer who is credited as the founder of modern community organizing. And in the introduction of his 1971 book, Rules for Radicals, he tells people who to model after if they want change in a society. "Lest we forget," he said, "at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement of the very first radical, from all our legends, mythology, and history. And who's to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did so effectively, that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer." You see, in the high echelons of the mystery schools or secret societies, they are taught that God is unjust and evil, and that Lucifer, now named Satan, was unfairly treated, and you'll be very surprised how many people believe that lie. And that is why you have to study the Word of God for yourself, so that no church, preacher, philosopher, critic, or any unbiblical school of thought will deceive you or sway your thoughts. And the opening 5 lines of Paradise Lost gives us an insight why. "Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste, and listen very carefully, brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat." There is both sadness and hope in those words. We all have to experience death someday, but there will be a time in the future when we will experience the new heaven and a new earth, and God is going to make everything whole again. It is a promise that only those who remain faithful will experience. But between now and then, the war continues. And not only the fall of Lucifer, but the fall of man is also being trivialized, a sort of mockery on the fall. And Satan is being exalted, as Saul Alinsky promoted, through, and we repeat again, the most powerful medium to to affect the mind of man: music. On an album cover by a group called White Snake, it is titled "Come and Get It," ridiculing the temptation of Eve. And on another album cover of a rapper called Hobson, there are two naked women, both with serpents, and the rapper with one around his neck, and the album is titled "No Shame," mocking the fall. Why is it important that we understand the fall? Dr. Wiley says that the recent discoveries in Assyria, which shows that the early post-Diluvian races had a fragmentary knowledge of the creation, the fall and the deluge, agreeing in substance with the Bible, and shows that pagan mythology may not be wholly the product of priests and the fancy of poets. The recovery of the world from the depth into which the fall has plunged it is both a slow and a laborious process. Human nature is still unchanged. The doctrine of the fall must necessarily be a fundamental one in every system of theology. It formed the starting point in those meager systems which existed in the pagan world. But it is not enough that we give it a place in our scheme of truth. It must be rightly and fully understood. Otherwise, all will be wrong in our system of religion. If there's one thing I've learned about studying history, is that you cannot understand the present unless you understand the past. And if you want to understand what is taking place in the world today, you have to understand creation and the fall. In the next part of this study, we're going to look at a creature that was worshipped all over the world. In The Origin of Nations Part 1, it was documented that the flood was the most recorded story in the ancient world, preserved in the memory and cultures of the earliest of men. There are some reminders that still exist today. The rainbow is a sign that the earth will never be destroyed by a global flood, and there are geological and climatic changes all over the earth, where Genesis records the climatic differences that would be in the post-flood earth. But where did man migrate from to repopulate the earth? The region we today call Turkey, but anciently called Anatolia and Asia Minor, was the starting point of man's migratory pattern, and some have taken a keen interest in that region. During the Cold War, the CIA flew over Mount Ararat in former Armenia and what is now Turkish territory, and took reconnaissance photography for its data. As a result of outside pressure from the public, it has grudgingly declassified a few documents that cover its covert mission over the mountains of Ararat. But its photographic imagery will forever remain classified, and they will never release them to the public. I wonder why. Ararat in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 4 is where men first settled, then repopulated the rest of the earth. But that geographical region holds some vital clues to man's early beginnings. It has the oldest mirror in the world made from obsidian, found alongside a skeleton, the oldest autopsy and brain surgery, the oldest skirt, the oldest leather shoe, the oldest winery, the oldest toys, the oldest peace treaty, and the oldest coined money. Early man was not savage, but civilized. On a close inspection of a petroglyph in Armenia is the oldest depiction of farming. Though farming did occur independently around the world, its earliest records can be traced to Asia Minor. But there is also something unique that can also be traced to that region: languages.
İnternet altyapısının gelişmesiyle adil kullanım noktasına artık
آیا شما انگلیسی صحبت می‌کنید؟ آیا
داشتن خط دوم جاده کابل و مشکلات بزرگ این راه
नायडू ने न्यायिक व्यवस्था में लंबित मामलों की बढ़ती फहरिस्त पर que cobran especial importancia en estos tiempos que corren. Víctor Hugo Rodríguez amplía.
Mais ça en a tout l'air. Depuis ce matin, des véhicules blindés barrent l'accès au Parlement et au siège.
del tutto fortuite, non è capitata l'occasione
ist
precedentemente.
letztendlich sehr viel klarer ausgegangen als in den letzten Tagen prognostiziert.
Κλίμα καθώς μπαίνει χειμώνα σε πόλεις και χωριά της Βορείου Ελλάδος.
Посчитаем полетное время, если с территории США стартующая МБР.
The government says it's focusing on making sure that public services are delivered.
English is considered as the language of the internet, the language for call centers in Asia, the dominant language in air traffic control. But where can English and all those other languages be traced to? Dr. Wiley is clear that in the first age, men converse with each other in a common language. In other words, that men started with one speech. Philology holds in its hand the clue by which it can track all tongues of the world through the perplexed labyrinth of diverse grammars, idioms and dialects to the one primeval tongue of the race. We find the ancestors of all numerous tongues of the nations, not in the classic languages of Greece and Rome, nor in the more ancient Semitic, but in the speech of the Indo-European races. British scientist Thomas Young coined the phrase Indo-European languages, which is the better term to use when describing the languages of Eurasia. But was Wiley right? Recent studies by linguists have confirmed that the mother tongue of the Indo-European languages that include English in Northern Europe and Hindi, a language spoken in India, Fiji and Pakistan, is traced to Turkey. And yes, J.A. Wiley, one of the most least known intellectuals of modern times, was spot on. Indo-European languages can be traced right back to the region that man first migrated from in Turkey, also known as Asia Minor and Anatolia. As scholars create charts to trace this language family tree, even the root words of all these languages have been traced to a tribe that is mentioned in the Bible. They call themselves the Hattai, but they are better known today as the Hittites. Czech Orientalist and linguist Frederick Rosny was the first person to successfully decipher the Hittite language. This 13th century BC silver Hittite seal is bilingual. The Hittites had two languages. It has Near Eastern cuneiform around the edge and a pictographic hieroglyphic script in the center that has been called Luwian. But who were the Hittites? The British newspapers The Telegraph and The Guardian published two well-documented articles on the origin of the Hittites and them being the progenitors of the Indo-European languages. This is how the Hittites depicted themselves on the left, and this is how the Egyptians depicted them on the right. They had light brown skin and black hair. The most famous Hittite in the Bible was Uriah, who was married to a woman of Judah and a soldier in King David's army. Oxford professor George Rawlinson said they were descendants of Ham. English lexicographer Sir William Smith said they were also descendants of Ham. And English publisher John Cassell said the same in his illustrated family Bible. The Telegraph confirmed this and said, in the biblical book of Genesis, the Hittites are named as the descendants of Ham through his son Canaan. They are described as a great power who dwell in the mountains. The Indo-European languages owe their words to Hittite-speaking farmers from Anatolia, who invented agriculture and spread their words as they sowed their seed 9,500 years ago, as recorded in The Guardian. The origin of the Indo-European family of languages includes English and most other European languages, as well as Persian, Hindi, and many others. Thus, mother is Mutter in German, Mat in Russian, Mada in Persian, Matka in Polish, and Mater in Latin are all cognates derived from the Proto-Indo-European word meta. What do you call a male sibling? If you speak English, he is your brother. Greek call him frata. Sanskrit Latin, Old Irish, brata, or brother, respectively. 99% of words in the Oxford English Dictionary are in fact borrowings from other languages, with its roots in Anatolia in modern Turkey around 7500 BC. So when Sir James August Murray and his team of linguists were compiling the Oxford English Dictionary, they were compiling words mostly from the Indo-European languages that could be traced to the Hittites in Asia Minor, in what today we'd call Turkey. The European Union has also taken an interest in that region, where the European Research Council has financed anthropological investigations into the earliest inhabitants of that region, where man first settled after the flood, and they have given $2.9 million to study the DNA of Neolithic era Anatolians to see who the earliest inhabitants of that region were and who they are currently related to. A Turkish billionaire has pumped millions into further research into an archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe, which means Potbelly Hill. Many people have taken a keen interest in this site in Turkey in recent times, for it holds many clues to man's earliest developments. And one of its seals has a serpent on the left and a tree in the center. Is it describing the fall in Eden? In the same region, but further down the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, was an ancient city connected to Turkey via the Euphrates, ancient Babylon. In The Origin of Nations Part 1, it was shown that the Telegraph financed an expedition to Iraq, ancient Babylon, and it was discovered that they excavated ancient tablets that, when deciphered, as Wiley said, it recorded the creation, the fall, and the flood. It was the English Assyriologist George Smith who deciphered these tablets, known as the Enuma Elish, that preserved man's early origins, and the Epic of Gilgamesh that recorded the flood. But it wasn't just in the Near East that man preserved the knowledge of the fall. The Greek culture had many deities. One of them was called Asclepius, a bearded man with a serpent entwined around a tree. What did the serpent around a tree represent? In the British Museum, there is a statue of the god Heracles or Hercules. Behind him is a serpent around a tree, guarding some fruit. And in Hercules' hands are 3 golden apples that can give eternal life or youth. They are from the Garden of Hesperides, where women sit around a tree that has the serpent who guards those eternal fruits. Does not that sound strikingly similar, with a bit of a distortion, to the story in the Garden of Eden? Milton said in his Paradise Lost, "His far more pleasant garden God ordained. Out of the fertile ground he caused to grow all trees of noblest kind for sight, smell, taste, and all amid them, and highlighted in red, the tree of life, high, eminent, blooming, ambrosial fruit." The tree of life was taken away from man in Eden, because if he ate it, he would live forever and immortalize his evil, according to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 22. But in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 7, the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God, is offered back to those who overcome this world and are faithful to the end. There is one more region that had one of the best preservations of creation, the fall, and the flood encoded in its native pictograms. In East Asia, there is a country that has one of the world's earliest civilizations and one of the best preserved cultures on earth. It is officially called China, but the indigenous call it a number of names, one of them being Shen Zhu, which means divine land. It is the world's most populous country, making up 20% of the world's population, and it is turning into one of the most surveillance states with the highest facial recognition database on earth. And if you were to pick up an item in your house, flat, bungalow or apartment, or if you own a digital device, most of them will most probably say made in China. The endangered red panda is endemic to China, as well as the black and white giant panda bear, known as one of China's national symbols. This worm was responsible for one of the most ancient trading routes, the once famous Silk Road, and the silkworm is also endemic to China, where its famous silk was traded from China throughout the rest of the world. China also has a distinct and a unique style of architecture and artwork among its ancient stone structures, and the reason they have been preserved intact so well, because they were protected by one of the most daring engineering projects in human history, the Great Wall of China. They also have a number of pyramids that are unknown to outsiders. For some unknown reason, the Chinese government would prefer to keep them from outsiders. They also experimented with different materials from early that included different metals and different stone, like jade. And as shown in The Origin of Nations Part 1, they have the world's oldest discovered pottery. Studies have shown that the earliest Chinese were highly civilized and cultured from the very beginning, and the dominant tribe are the Han Chinese, who make up 92% of the total population, where almost half of the population of China are descended from 3 Neolithic grandfathers. DNA is also helping us to more clearly understand the earliest Chinese, for when archaeologists and anthropologists unearthed some of the earliest art and skeletal remains, it also confirmed they were highly cultured and did not evolve, but were human. When you also look at the artwork and sculpture of the Chinese in different museums in England, and the famous terracotta soldiers in China, you will see that after thousands of years, they are still the same, with their distinct epicanthic eye fold, very light brown skin, and mostly black but sometimes brown hair. Chinese money was also distinct, for the coins had a hole carved in the center, but it was discovered in other parts of the world. The giraffe is endemic to Africa, and they found paintings of the giraffe in the courts of ancient China, and Chinese money was unearthed in Kenya in East Africa, and the Daily Mail newspaper documented that they were already trading with East Africans before Europeans arrived. The Chinese invented the compass around 2,000 years ago, but they have many other firsts. You see, the book of Ecclesiastes said, "Is there anything rough it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us." There was a debate whether it was the Italians, Arabs, or the Chinese who had invented noodles. But recent archaeological discoveries have shown that it was actually the Chinese who introduced noodles to the world over 4,000 years ago. Tea is an aromatic global beverage that spread throughout Europe and the rest of the world through Portuguese Jesuit priests and the British Empire. These women from the Republic of China in Taiwan are picking the leaves, for tea is also traced to China, where the oldest tea was found in the tomb of an emperor. Paper money may be obsolete in the next couple of years, but where did it actually originate from? In the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, in the money section, is the world's oldest paper money that was first developed in China, and this has also been confirmed by the BBC. It was the printing press that catapulted the Protestant Reformation in Europe that laid the foundation for the modern Western media, due to 2 men, the German printer Johannes Gutenberg and the Dutch printer Lawrence Koster. But printing has older roots. In the British Library in London, England, is a book that was taken from this cave in China, and inside of that cave was the Diamond Sutra, dated to around 868 AD, and it is the oldest known dated printed book in the world. Most people wear trousers, especially jeans, to keep our legs warm, but the oldest known discovered pair of trousers were traced once again to China. as documented in both Time magazine and The Telegraph. One of the most famous bells in the world is the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States, an iconic symbol of American independence. But the oldest bells in the world have been discovered in, guess where? China. A set of bronze bells found in a tomb dated to around 433 BC. But China has some other influences on the modern world. Golf is a famous middle-class sport for the wealthy. But the most popular sport is football, that is more accessible for the working class community. Though they both have global appeal, guess where they both originated from? In China, football was known as suju and was invented in the Han Dynasty, and both football and the sport of golf were invented by the Chinese. But China also has another influence over the modern world. The Greeks called this green insect the mantis, that means a diviner, for the praying mantis was considered to have supernatural powers in ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and in ancient Assyria, and it was one of the many creatures the ancient Chinese mimicked and developed its move into a fighting technique. But the root of this art form's mysticism in Asian martial arts can be traced to the serpent, for the dragon was the emblem adorned on the robes of successive Chinese emperors. But one of these rulers, Taizong, allowed Nestorian Christianity to flourish in 7th century China and made the Tang Dynasty one of the most successful epochs in Chinese history. But China already had an early knowledge of God, creation, the fall, and the flood. Many Chinese visit the temple in heaven. One of the oldest Chinese manuscripts, Shu Jing, which means Book of History, compiled by Confucius, records a sacrifice by Emperor Shun around 2230 BC to the heavenly emperor Shang Di, the ancient Chinese name for God. In the British Museum is the Chinese written language written on boards and inscriptions found on oracle bones with the earliest references to Shang Di found on them. But that wasn't the only thing they discovered in the ancient Chinese language. The Chinese pictogram for create is comprised of dust or mud, mouth or breath, and the radical for walking. The pictogram for garden comprises of dust, breath, two people enclosed by a big enclosure on the outside, describing creation. And the Chinese pictogram for corvette has a woman under trees. Traces of the Eden story preserved in the Chinese pictograms. In The Origin of Nations Part 1, the famous Chinese 8 immortals on a boat were mentioned, and the Chinese word for ship is a boat on the left side and 8 mouths or people, a knowledge of the flood. But despite this preservation of the creation, the fall, and the flood in many of the ancient cultures, all the nations still chose who they would rather worship, and it was not God, but the serpent. And if you think that this is a relic of a bygone age, watch and listen very carefully to this commercial by the Italian company Bulgari promoting its jewelry.
He reigned over the Middle Kingdom and created humanity. Before embodying power and wisdom, he shone on the foreheads of pharaohs and presided over the eternal renewal of days and nights. He lived on Olympus, inspiring peace and healing.
Since the fall, man is still buying into the lie of the serpent at Eden and clearly has not learned. And in a book titled The Secret Teachings of All Ages, the late Manly Palmer Hall, a 33rd degree Freemason, details how vast this lie at Eden spread. He documented that serpent worship in some form has permeated all parts of the earth. There is a legend that in the beginning of the world, winged serpents roamed the earth. among nearly all these ancient peoples, the serpent was accepted as the symbol of wisdom or salvation. It has long been viewed as the emblem of immortality. It is a symbol of reincarnation or metempsychosis because it actually sheds its skin, reappearing as it were in a new body. In the ancient mysteries, the serpent was the symbol of the physician. The serpent moon staff of Hermes remains the emblem of the medical profession. Electricity was commonly symbolized by the serpent because of its motion. The initiates of the mysteries were often referred to as serpents, and their wisdom was considered analogous to the divinely inspired power of the snake. In the Orient, that is in ancient Babylon, it seems to be the home of pagan idolatry, for its global influence was so vast that the prophet Jeremiah said that it made the entire earth polluted with her false ideology. King Nebuchadnezzar II was a brilliant architect, but before he secured his place in eternity, his buildings were adorned with the dragon. This forked-tongued reptile was displayed throughout ancient Babylon, and some of its more prominent idolatrous icons was the serpent-headed staff. But it didn't just stay in Babylon, it spread throughout Afro-Eurasia. The Assyrian monarch on the left has in his hand the serpent crozier on the left. Pharaoh Ramses of Egypt has his serpent crozier upheld on his right shoulder. And this priest from ancient Rome, as seen on this gem, also has his serpent crozier in his hand, but it did not die out with pagan Rome. In the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, England, are on display these staffs of the Roman Catholic bishops, and on close observation at the top of these staffs, they end in the serpent. So even if the physical kingdom of Babylon is no longer, its spirit still continues in other systems. Some of the existing residents of ancient Babylon, that is modern-day Iraq, have been mercilessly hunted down by the Islamic State. You may wonder why. The Yazidis still, to this very day, worship and give homage to the serpent, with their very own temples dedicated to it. But Babylon's ideas have still spread further afield. This is Norfolk Park Hospital in northwest London, and on one of its buildings is the double serpent around a tree, as Manly P. Hall mentioned. But where did this emblem come from? In the Louvre Museum in Paris, France, there are statues of a ruler who was born in 2144 BC called Gudea, who was the head of the state of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia. Carved onto his libation cup is the winged serpent, and next to it is the double serpent around the tree, the current symbol of the medical profession. It also became an emblem for the Canaanite Phoenician baby king cult of Baal Hamon and his female partner Tanit. And today, it is sometimes almost impossible to distinguish between people who are into the occult and Christian Orthodox bishops, for they both sport the same double serpent emblem of Babylon that you can still find in museums all around the world. When archaeologists excavated ancient Egypt, it was one culture that was definitely dedicated to the serpent. The pharaohs adorned their heads with the cobra as a part of their crown. That is why the prophet Ezekiel called the pharaohs the great dragon, because of their total dedication to the serpent. The winged serpent played a central role in Egyptian worship, and when the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun was excavated, among some of his most prized artifacts he wanted to carry with him to the afterlife was the winged serpent. In Greece, Athens was named after the goddess Athena, who has her serpent with her, where the Greeks offered worship to that reptile. In Greek Sparta, hero worship deities had their protective serpent behind the throne. the serpent was a symbol of the dead soul who had deceased, as seen in the sculpture of a Greek warrior. In Greek temples, such as the Oracle of Delphi, she is adorned with serpents on her hair and serpents on her dress. In ancient Crete, one of its most famous deities was the Minoan snake goddess. Greek warriors took a serpent shield into battle with them, and the winged serpent is adorned on this Greek chariot throne on a vase. Many people are familiar with the city Pompeii, whose inhabitants were destroyed by the volcano Vesuvius. But what many people are unaware of is that when archaeologists started to excavate Pompeii, there was one creature that dominated every aspect of that culture. In the temples, in the houses, and practically everywhere you went, you would see either a painting or a carved sculpture of a serpent. It dominated the entire landscape of that ancient culture. And the winged serpent was also a central figure that people believed took them to the underworld in ancient Rome. To this very day in India, the serpent is still given homage as an emblem of worship. And as you go through museums in London, England, the serpent is depicted as a protective power over nearly every single deity. In the Americas, the serpent was also the center of worship and adoration. This is the enormous serpent mound in Ohio, in North America, a gigantic earthen sculpture representative of a snake, as described by its historical marker. But it was in Central and South America where serpent worship would find a deeper home. Though people are familiar with the Maya and the Aztecs, this region was also once peopled with different ethnic groups of Black Africans, Chinese Asians, and Europeans. These sculptures clearly show different ethnicities, and they all worshipped the serpent. It was a symbol of ancestor worship, and the serpent was displayed all over Mesoamerica. When the Mesoamericans saw lightning coming out of the sky, they thought it was a serpent, and carved the serpent, portraying it as lightning, as can be seen in this artifact in the British Museum. And like all the other cultures all over the earth, the winged serpent was also revered in Mexico. This was the global worship that once dominated the entire earth after the flood. But at the appointed time, there was one who was going to come and bruise the serpent's head to counter the serpent's influence of self-worship. One whose mission is still very misunderstood. If there's one thing I have never understood from a child to this very day, it is racism. It is very strange how one ethnic group can hate each other so badly. But when you study every single one of them, they all worshipped the serpent. In the last part of this study, we're going to look at the most controversial figure that walked this earth. The Roman Empire was the first effort since the days of Nimrod to unite all the different races under one global system. Their leaders were sometimes adorned in sandals, bare legs, and the infamous Caesarean tunic. And centuries later, others who emulated the patronage of pagan Rome would adopt identical attire. In the British Museum and other museums around Europe, you can see the different beliefs this Mediterranean culture incorporated into their empire as a result of its conquest throughout Afro-Eurasia. The swastika was adopted from India. The system was adopted from Egypt. The cult of Mithra was adopted from Medo-Persia. The nature god Jupiter was a Roman form of the Greek god Zeus. The animal liver inside of the palm of a hand for divination was adopted from Babylon. And as shown in the Origin of Nations Part 1, the Roman attire was adopted from the Assyrians. The man who propelled this empire on the world map was the Italian military general Julius Caesar, and his empire stretched all the way to northern Europe in Britain, that he chronicled in his own words. I gave instructions that all vessels were to be the most convenient for the channel crossing, being some 28 miles from the coast of Britain. On the coast of southern Britain is where Julius Caesar was to stretch the limits of his empire. And if you were to visit Britain and take a train to Walmer, and half an hour to 40-minute walk, you will come to the beach where Julius Caesar landed to expand the Roman Empire. There is a monument that is a memorial to this famous Italian imperialist expedition to the British Isles, and it documented when he landed there in the year 55 BC. This is verified by a historian who recorded that it was in the year 55 BC that Julius Caesar invaded Britain, while he said, "His empire was but a vast political machine for carrying out the will of one man." The Roman gathered the scattered races into one empire and taught them to be obedient to one law. In his efforts to conquer the then known world, the English Orientalist Humphrey Prideaux recorded that Julius Caesar killed 1,192,000 men. That's a huge loss of human life. And then he eventually himself was killed by men in his own government. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. His coin in the British Museum has the serpent staff alongside his head, and this was also adopted by his successor and stepson Caius Octavius. Caius also adopted a sort of breastplate shield that also was adorned with serpents, the most worshipped creature on earth. Caius Octavius' empire was huge, and he embarked on a massive religious or pagan revival, building temples to the gods he believed helped him in battle. He was the first world leader chronicled in the New Testament, and he is better known as Augustus Caesar. But something radical was to happen in his and his successor's empire. His successor, Tiberius Caesar, was not particularly loved by the masses. He always looked so gloomy and boring, and was very rarely seen in public. But unbeknownst to him, the course of human history was about to change. On this stone slab, his name is mentioned at the top, and underneath is the name Pilate. This coin has a name and title of Herod, the Tetrarch, and Jewish historian Flavius Josephus mentioned all three of them, but they were also mentioned in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. And at the appointed time, one's presence was going to be felt. H.G. Wells was an English science fiction writer and a eugenicist, who was taught evolution by his teacher, Thomas Huxley. His distorted views on race was a failed attempt at reinterpreting the world according to the colonial destiny of the British Empire. But sometimes you could still gather seeds of truth from people who you least expect can shine light on certain episodes of human history. This evolutionist said, "It is a fact in history that the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth had in it something profoundly new and creative. He preached a new kingdom of heaven in the hearts and in the world of men. There was nothing in his teaching, so far as we can judge it at this distance of time, to clash or interfere with any discovery or expansion of the history of the world and mankind. At Calvary, heaven and earth were reunited once again, and where the first Adam failed, the second Adam restored. And the potter could now remold the clay and restore fallen man back into the image of God, and the good shepherd could now seek the lost sheep that had gone astray. Jesus was the only person who knew the depth of the issues, for he saw Satan as lightning fall from heaven, and he knew that the root cause of this conflict that spread to earth is over: worship. He was the one who bruised Satan and began to take away from him the worship of the serpent, which is self-worship, right back to the pure worship of the Creator God. And it penetrated into the territory of the Roman Empire, of the Caesars, and further afield. In Afro-Eurasia, Ethiopian Bishop Abba Gregorius taught the bilingual Ethiopian languages of Ge'ez and Amharic to Europeans. Hunayn ibn Ishaq was an Iraqi-born Assyrian historian, Christian scholar and physician who introduced to the Muslim world science, maths and history. And Oxford professor John Wycliffe, educated in the laws of optics, chemical analysis, the physiological genesis of sleep, geometrical and arithmetical lines, and national economics, used his extraordinary talent not to be famous and popular, but to teach an illiterate nation the ability to read. You see, righteousness exalts a nation. Today, how will the masses hear and understand about the origin of the nations, the creation, the fall, and the coming Redeemer, if nobody does not tell them? If you were to see this woman, don't take out a tissue to wipe the lipstick off her lips before you have even spoken to her. Don't offer this woman to buy her a cardigan to cover her arms before you have even shown her God's love. And don't ask her if that's a weave. If you were to approach this woman with a ring in her lip and a tattoo of death on her arm, don't ask her if she is auditioning for the latest Avatar. Don't push people away before they have even heard about Christ. Treat them as people who Jesus died for, and always remember that every day you are still wrestling with the old man. Pressing issues are coming on very strong, and the LGBT movement is attempting to undermine what took place at creation. Musicians like Celine Dion is promoting a gender fluidity brand of clothing, so there is not a distinguishing mark between both male and female attire for children. But there is a bit of a problem. The Russian channel RT produced a documentary titled I Want My Sex Back for transgender people who have regretted having a sex change. The Telegraph said, why aren't people talking about it? They won't. Why? For it will damage the LGBT agenda and prove that it will never work. You see, the Bible teaches that God created man and woman, and that each gender has specific roles and functions. Men cannot have babies, breastfeed a child, and have periods, for their body was not created that way. And when adults grow to prepare for marriage and continue the cycle of the next generation, they court. And when they develop trust and know that the individual is compatible to live with forever, they eventually will get married, settle down and continue the cycle of life and create children. And studies continue to show that this is what has always kept societies healthy and stable. Not only did Jesus teach creation at the beginning, he also said that mankind was originally created both male and female, and that the first thing that God instituted at the beginning of time was the beautiful union between a man and a woman, which is marriage. But he also taught that man has to study history, especially the flood and the spiritual condition of the earth at that time, and how that mindset will be revived again at the end of time. He also encouraged people to study the book of Daniel, for it chronicles the rise and fall of nations by using symbolic language, and how God will eventually rebuild an eternal kingdom where neither moth nor rust does corrupt. But there was a distinct teaching of Jesus that was like no other. Death is something most people fear, and because it is very hard and strange for people to comprehend, films are being released attempting to show that man can bring their loved ones back to life if he only tries. The loss of a loved one is so traumatizing that 6 in 10 grieving people believe that they see or hear dead loved ones. And some of the top names in entertainment are being led to believe that they can contact their dead relatives.
He's helped celebrities like Oprah and Kim Kardashian communicate with the dead.
God told Adam and Eve that if they sinned, they shall surely die. But the serpent told Eve, ye shall not surely die. And this is why people believe that they can contact their dead relatives, but they do not believe that they are dead. For entertainment is making people believe in reincarnation, which Manly P. Hall said come from the serpent. And in section 2 of this study, the serpent was believed to be an incarnation of a dead ancestor in ancient Greece, and also among the Maya in ancient Mexico. And in Pompeii, the ancestor worship shrine also shows a depiction of the serpent. So we can see where ancestor worship comes from, the serpent. In parts of Asia also, they still pray to their ancestors. But in The Origin of Nations Part 1, in the highest-grossing theatrical film of all time, the 2009 Avatar, James Cameron exposed audiences to the ancient belief of ancestor worship. And 9 years later, through the film Black Panther, Marvel reintroduced audiences again to the same belief of ancestor worship. Now the King of Jerusalem, the Son of David, is very clear in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 that we all know that we will eventually die, but the dead do not know a thing. And if the Bible is unequivocally clear that their memory, love, hatred and envies all perished at death, you have to ask yourself this very important question: what are them people seeing and hearing? But what did Jesus teach that was unique to the early church? Irish-born British evangelist Dr. Henry Grattan Guinness said, all the early fathers up to the time of Constantine, including Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Victorinus, Methodius, Lactantius, held that the first resurrection of Revelation chapter 20 was a literal resurrection. US-based theologian Philip Schaff confirmed this also and documents that the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body, which was an essential article of the apostolic tradition and is incorporated in almost all the ancient creeds, the bodies of the righteous grow green in their graves to burst forth in glorious bloom on the morning of the resurrection. The first Christians from the beginning set great store by this comforting doctrine, and it was still preserved in the 19th century amongst one of the earliest of the churches. In The Origin of Nations Part 1, we were also introduced to the mighty Assyrian Empire of northern Iraq, whose capital city was Nineveh. And even after the empire died, the Christian leaders were still sporting the same hairstyle and beard of their forefathers. They were one of the oldest Christian communities who were situated in Iraq, the church which was at Babylon. Hilon Ibn Ishaq was a member of this church, and when the British archaeologist Sir Austin Henry Layard paid a visit to this community, he saw that they preserved a more primitive Christianity than the one he saw in the West. Layard said that the doctrines of Christianity had early penetrated into the Assyrian provinces. To Protestants, the doctrines and rites of a primitive sect of Christians who have ever remained untainted by the superstitions of Rome must be of high importance. So what do they believe? We acknowledge, they said, one baptism for the remission of sins and the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. The resurrection of the body was the unique teaching of Christ. Their Assyrian forefathers in Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah, and Jesus said that they will rise up in the judgment. But what will make them rise will be the resurrection of the just. And this resurrection will bring immortality like the angels, for angels do not get married. That destroys the Book of Enoch argument. But there will be 2 resurrections during a space of 1,000 years, a resurrection of life of the just for those who are faithful, and a resurrection of damnation for those who rejected the invitation to eternity. And prior to these resurrections, Jesus has called death a sleep, especially when he was describing the death of Lazarus. So when we are dead, it is described as a sleep. And those who have died and believe in the resurrection know they will be awake out of their sleep. The narrator paid a visit to the grave of Dr. J. Wiley in Edinburgh, Scotland. And at the bottom of his family grave it reads, "Till he come," just waiting for the resurrection. This grave of a former African slave in Bristol, England, on the second last line it reads, "Whose glorious second coming, here I wait," waiting for the resurrection. The narrator visited the grave of Italian-born Scottish astronomer Charles Piazzi Smith, the first person to successfully measure the Great Pyramid in Egypt that his grave was modeled after. His wife Jessie Smith was buried alongside him, and on the second line of her epitaph it reads, "She fell asleep in the Lord Jesus Christ," describing her death as a sleep. At St. Giles the Abbot Church in Kent are the buried remains of the British scientist Thomas Young, the man who deciphered the infamous Rosetta Stone. And on the 11th line of his epitaph it reads, "He died in the hopes of the resurrection of the just," waiting for the first resurrection. In North America is the grave of Joseph Priestley, the English-born natural philosopher and theologian, credited with the discovery of oxygen. And on the last 2 lines of his grave it reads, "I will lay me down in peace, and sleep till I awake in the morning of the resurrection. So this is the apostolic position. But to make our position airtight, we're going to follow the divine mandate of Jesus, where we will use 2 or 3 witnesses, where every word may be established. French reformer John Calvin wrote, "Many who sleep in the earth of dust, connecting the salvation of the church with the final resurrection and with the second coming of Christ, implying the hope of a resurrection not founded on natural causes, but depending upon the inestimable power of God, which surpasses all our senses." First witness. German reformer Martin Luther said, "Christians who lie on the ground are no longer dead, but sleepers, people who will surely rise again." For when we say that people are asleep, we refer to those who are lying down, but will wake up and rise again. Of the latter, we do not say that they are asleep, but they are inanimate corpses. Therefore, by that very word asleep, scriptures indicate the future resurrection. Second witness. English theologian Matthew Henry said, "The grave is the prison of dead bodies, where they are detained, their furnace where they are consumed. Yet, in prospect in their resurrection, we may call it their bed, where they sleep to be awakened, their treasury where they are laid up to be used again. Even those that are not put into graves shall arise, but because most are put into graves, Christ uses this expression, all that are in the graves." The Jews used the word Sheol for the grave, which signifies the state of the dead. All that are in that state shall hear. Third witness. In the English bookseller John Cassell's Illustrated Bible it reads, "Them which are asleep." This is only another and more Christian mode of expressing the death of the body. There is no reference to the sleep of consciousness of the soul in the intermediate state. As the Christian is taught to look forward to the morn of the resurrection, so he is permitted to regard death under the figure of sleep. And he is enjoined not to be sorry as men without hope for them that sleep in Jesus. Fourth witness. American theologian Albert Barnes said, "The language denotes the ground or earth considered as composed of dust, and would naturally refer to those who are dead and buried, considered as sleeping there with the hope of the resurrection." Fifth witness. And in John Milton's Areopagitica, the book that laid the foundation for modern free speech and a free press, it reads, "It is not possible for man to sever the wheat from the tares, the good fish from the other fry. That must be the angel's ministry at the end of mortal things, till her master's second coming. He shall bring together every joint and member, and shall mold them into an immortal feature of loveliness and perfection." Sixth witness. Overlooking the River Thames in Embankment Gardens is a statue of 16th century English reformer William Tyndale, and in a response to a challenge by Sir Thomas More, he wrote, "And ye, in putting them in heaven, hell and purgatory, destroy the arguments wherewith Christ and Paul prove the resurrection." Seventh witness. London, England has many plaques and monuments dedicated to English theologian and reformer John Wesley, who founded Methodism. And in his notes on the New Testament he wrote, "The time is coming when not 2 or 3, but all shall arise." The resurrection of life, that resurrection which leads to life everlasting. Eighth witness. The man who influenced his opposition to the British slave trade was a former slave, or Laudo Equiano, who was the first main abolitionist in the UK. And in his autobiography he said, "Now the Bible was my only companion and comfort. I prized it much, with many thanks to God that I could read it for myself, and was not left to be tossed about or led by man's devices and notions. By free grace I was persuaded that I had a part and lot in the first resurrection." Ninth witness. In St. Paul's Cathedral in London, England, are the buried remains of a biblical scholar, an English cleric, Thomas Newton, and in his dissertations on the prophecies he wrote, "The martyrs and confessors of Jesus are raised from the dead. This is the first resurrection, a particular resurrection preceding the general one at least 1,000 years. The sons of the resurrection therefore shall not die again, but shall live in eternal bliss, as well as enjoy all the glories of the millennium, be priests of God and of Christ, and reign with him 1,000 years." 10th witness. This plaque in Northampton, England is dedicated to nonconformist Philip Doddridge. And this famous hymn writer wrote, "Now I stand in judgment in the midst of this assembly, not for any crime that I have committed, but indeed for the hope of that promise of a resurrection to eternal life and happiness by means of the Messiah, which in time past was made by God unto our fathers." 11th witness. The Royal Astronomical Society had many famous members over the years. One of them was a scientist and minister, Scotsman Thomas Dick. In his famous Christian Philosopher he wrote, "The doctrine of a resurrection from the dead at first view appears to involve in it a variety of difficulties and apparent contradictions. That a complex organic machine as the human body is consisting of thousands of diversified parts for the performance of its functions, after it has been reduced to atoms, and those atoms dispersed to the four winds of heaven, should be again reared up with the same materials in a new and more glorious form, is an idea which seems to baffle the human comprehension, and in all probability would never have entered the mind of man had it not been communicated by divine revelation." 12th witness. Charles Beecher, the American minister and hymn writer, wrote, "Christ naturally and unaffectedly spoke on the basis of the ancient faith that heaven is our native land. That was the existing faith. The world is not a prison, but a world of redeeming grace, built by the mediator and for him. He placed us here, and in the morning of the resurrection will present it to himself a glorious church, not having a spot or wrinkle or any such thing." 13th witness. Now that we are compassed about with so great cloud of witnesses, let us keep our minds focused on that future first resurrection. This study covered a number of topics: current affairs, politics, nature, history, languages, the importance of childhood, the failings of secular ideas, living healthy, ancient cultures, DNA, and the fall of man. And every area that has been covered leads you right back to the Bible. But the journey is not complete. We still have a lot more ground to cover. I know this study was very intense and covered a variety of topics. It was meant to be that way, and I make no apologies. But as I encourage you at the beginning of this study, please research everything you have seen so you can make your own decisions for yourself. Even at the Doors would like to say a special thanks for those who have supported the work through prayers, words of encouragement, and financial support through checks and international money orders that have helped in different areas like travel and research. If you'd like to further support this work, you can either click on the link below or type on your keyboard, tablet, or phone www.evenatthedoors.org. And when you arrive on the site, on the top right hand side you will see the word Contact. Click on it and the drop down will say GoFundMe. Click on the GoFundMe button, then scroll down to the bottom of the page and click on the red button that says Support Us, and you will come onto the official GoFundMe page. There is a short 2-minute video you can watch that encourages to support the work. You can then click on the donate button on the right side of the video, and whatever you would like to contribute, either small or large, it will help to continue to support current and future projects. If you are unable to send funds, you can still support by subscribing and sharing this and other studies through all the social and other mediums available. For those who live in the UK, the British Museum tours will continue at either the end of February or the beginning of March. Thanks again for all those who have continuously supported, even at the Doors. God bless.